Welcome to the official Finovate podcast with Greg Palmer. In 2007, Finovate set out to create a dynamic fintech showcase featuring live 7-minute demos. For more than a decade, our global event series has brought together tens of thousands of people from across the fintech spectrum to see cutting-edge technologies. Now you can find out what goes on behind the scenes as key influencers and innovators share the stories that they don't get to tell you from stage. Here's a glimpse of what we have in store this episode.
Banks have an enormous opportunity now. I think this could herald the return of relationship banking. And banks are going to be able to buy these new products that you're seeing at Finovate and plug them, I believe, on top of their existing technology.
And now, your host, Greg Palmer.
Thanks for tuning in to the Finovate podcast. This is your host, Greg Palmer. We have 2 episodes for you this week, which are going to focus on small businesses and the way that fintech is changing the game for those types of companies. Joining me today is a woman named Karen Mills, who recently wrote a book about her experience working in small business with the Obama administration. And then we're going to follow that up by talking to a company called Arrival Bank later on this week, a neobank that is also focusing on small businesses. So 2 different angles there, looking at the opportunities that exist for banks, for small business owners as a result of the way fintech has evolved. Let's go ahead and jump into the interview with Karen. I'm chatting today with Karen Mills, Senior Fellow of Harvard Business School, former small business administrator during the Obama administration, and author of the book, Fintech, Small Business, and the American Dream. I've had a chance to read the book, and I'm really excited, Karen, that you're able to be here chatting with me about it. There's a lot to unpack. And as I was reading it, I was really struck by how many of those ideas that are in this book I really believe in. So before we get too far, though, let's go ahead and start with kind of a high-level overview, an oversimplified summary of the book, if you will. And you can agree with my summary or not. But the way that I kind of think of it is relatively simple proposition. Small businesses are good for the American economy. Fintech is good for small businesses. It is filling some voids that have been left by the traditional banking industry. And right now, there are ways that fintech can continue to help that community out. Have I got that at all right?
Absolutely, Greg. It's great to be talking to you. I know that you have been doing fintech really as long as I have. So you've got a great perspective on this industry. You know, the impetus for this book really came from my time working for President Obama, running the SBA. And the first month in that job was the first quarter of 2009. If you remember back that far, it was the financial crisis. And small business was really suffering because banks had closed their doors to small businesses because of the pressures they had from the financial crisis. And at the SBA, I was able to raise the SBA guarantee to 90%. And see what happened when 1,000 banks came back to SBA lending and helped small businesses get access to that capital. So it really proved to me some of the points you just made. Small businesses are critical to the economy, and they depend on their banks for access to the money to keep their businesses going. In this book, though, we are talking about a whole transformation that technology might bring to that ecosystem, which makes it even more exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I came to fintech at about the same time that you did. I joined Finovate in late 2009. My first show was spring of 2010. And at that point, it was clear that there were so many holes left by the Great Recession, and small business was absolutely one of them. We saw innovators at that stage already eyeing up that market, looking at that community and thinking we can really step in and help here. So talk to me a little bit about what you saw in those first couple of years that led you to believe, fintech really has some answers that to the questions that the industry needed.
The problems, in small business banking really go beyond just the Great Recession. It's painful to get a loan for a small business. And the reason is there are 2 major frictions in the marketplace. The first is what we call in the book information opacity. It's just hard to see inside a small business. Much easier to see a consumer can get a mortgage, but to figure out whether a business is making money, especially if it's very small, is very difficult for a bank. And it leads to this sort of 3-month paper-intensive loan process. The second problem is what we call heterogeneity. All small businesses are different. One day you're lending to a dry cleaner, the next day to a funeral home. What we see in technology today is that big data has the potential to take away both of those frictions. When you saw Cabbage and some other early innovators come in and be able to sort of suck up all kinds of new data and look inside a small business, the information opacity issue really was in part made easier. And the same with heterogeneity. If you have 1,000 dry cleaners, you can pretty well tell whether the data on the 1,000th and first dry cleaner makes it a good one or a bad one. So as we see these new methods coming to banking, we see that banking is going to be transformed, and it really hasn't changed in 50 or 100 years. So this is a good thing.
I completely agree on that point. I think it is time for some change. And I think the role that data plays is really interesting as well, not only from the standpoint of how do financial institutions make smart decisions when it comes to lending, but also how small business owners can use information from other companies in the industry to make intelligent decisions. And this was actually a really interesting chapter in the book, the story of a coffee shop owner who was getting an alert that her competitor is having a sale on iced coffee during what looks like it's going to be a hot week. She's able to anticipate how many customers she's likely to lose as a result of that competitor sale, take measures to counteract that with her own coupon and get that out the door, and leaving aside
I call that small business utopia, because you're right. It would be so amazing if a small business had a dashboard that basically took this same information we were talking about and projected its cash flows and maybe even gave ideas for sales.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the question, because we've seen that type of play on stage at Finovate before, and the question frequently becomes, how do you get that technology into the hands of small business owners who are overworked, have their attention pulled in a variety of different places, and are literally fighting for their own economic futures? And a lot of the companies that we've seen have looked at banks as a potential distribution partner for that type of technology, as a value add to some of the lending services that they can offer. And also there's kind of a bank angle as well. If I can keep you as a small business customer of mine in business longer, I stand to make more money off of that relationship too. We've seen maybe some moderate success there, but this kind of brings me to my next point. The chapter, the playbook for banks, was one that I think is really interesting to our audience, talking about how banks can use data, use these fintech innovations to do something more here. And one of my favorite pieces to it was actually, there's a couple of really simple little charts. One of them, just a 2-question flow chart. First, does the bank want to serve more small business customers? Yes or no? And if the answer to that is no, does the bank want to diversify investments into alternative SMB lending? I think the question really is that simple at its core. How did you kind of distill it down to that level as you were putting together this book?
Well, I've spent a lot of time with banks, and I have to tell you, one of the conclusions of this book is that banks have an enormous opportunity now. Everybody first thought when the fintechs came up, banks are dinosaurs, David is going to kill Goliath, oh my gosh, banks are in danger. But I think the story is evolving differently. Banks have customers. Banks have some data and information on those customers, and they have low-cost deposits. They have cheap money, and so they can outprice the fintechs. But even more than that, I think the future looks more like small businesses are going to their banks, they're sitting down with their banker, and both of them have in front of them this dashboard I described, Small Business Utopia. And the banker is saying, you are pre-approved for a loan. I can see already that you need the money, but that you have the ability to pay it back. But now let's have a conversation about your business and figure out the right product for you, the right fit for your business. Maybe you should borrow even more and get that place next door. I think this could herald the return of relationship banking. And banks are going to be able to buy these new products that you're seeing at Finovate and plug them, I believe, on top of their existing technology. We got to get the core providers, to move a little bit to make these new fintech products fit inside the systems. But if we can get that to work, then we are going to have a return of community banks and relationship banking.
I completely agree. And I know a lot of the community bankers that I talk to would agree with that statement, that the core banking systems are a limiting factor right now. I don't believe that can continue forever. I think something has to give there, because the size of the opportunity is massive. And for banks who aren't able
I
to
think there's
take
a
advantage
lot of
of
pressure on those core banking systems to change. We only need one of them, or maybe even a new system to start competition there.
Yeah, well, here you go. For any innovators listening to this one, there's your challenge thrown down to create that better banking system, that back end core system that allows for it. Because I think, and we talked a little bit about this before we push record, but based on what I've seen, banks don't really innovate too well themselves. They're very good at acquiring innovation and buying it or offering it in a white label platform. If they have that motivation to do so. But I think for banks to really take advantage of this, they have to be able to partner with outside tech providers. And that in turn will enable them to partner with small businesses. And I think the way that you described it there really is a partnership that you're talking about, where you sit down, a small business owner and a banker, and say, here's your roadmap. Here's where you're going to need some money. Here's your expected cash flow. Here's how I know you'll be able to pay me back, because I'm looking at these data points here. And I think if that happens, I think you're right, that small business utopia really becomes a reality. And so many good ripple effects happen there for the American economy. And I would say for the banking industry, particularly perhaps the community banking industry.
I'm spending a lot of time now on what we call entrepreneurship. How do you innovate in an established organization? And it's hard because the regular organization doesn't want to change. In fact, it will kill anything that looks like it's going to threaten its regular profit stream. But what new managers and bank executives have to do right now is really think about their customers. They have to think about, what problem will innovation help me solve? And if there's something in it for the customer or for the branch banker, for one of their key players, then they're going to reach out to innovators and say, I need to solve my customer's problem. My competitor is doing something. I need to figure out how to change. And at that moment, we need to have the ability for them to get it easily. And this is why I think we have to create not only the new innovation from the fintechs, but a regulatory framework that includes open banking, like in the UK. So we can encourage an innovative system where people can upload their data to one of these new applications, and banks can use it, as well as the customer getting some new innovative product. So this new smart regulation is actually a key to this as well.
And the book actually closes out with a chapter, or a couple of chapters rather, on regulation. And,
I know I didn't want to put everyone to sleep, but I do have 2 chapters on regulation.
You got to have it in there, though. It's a vital piece of it, though. I'm afraid that's the time that we have for right now. The book is called Fintech, Small Business, and the American Dream, and there really is a lot in there to unpack. And I don't just say that because it's littered with Finovate companies like Lendio, Cabbage, On Deck Capital, Prosper, Zero, Yodlee, Credit Karma, and probably some others that I didn't find. But I would highly recommend picking up a copy. It's a really good read, and you'll find some really concrete action items, whether you're on the fintech side of it, whether you're on the bank side of it, and that regulatory piece as well is crucial. And perhaps, Karen, we'll get you back on to talk a little bit about that regulatory piece. I suspect there's a lot that we could unpack there as well.
I would love to do that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank
you. Look forward to seeing how your conversations continue to unfold, and look forward to having you back on the show as well.
Thank you so much.
It was a great conversation there with Karen. A lot, obviously, that we weren't able to talk about. I think we're going to have Karen back on the show a little bit later on and talk a little bit about some of the regulatory pieces, which she mentioned. The last few chapters of her book do talk about that. I think that's a discussion in its own right. So we'll get Karen back on the show to talk through that piece in a little bit. In the meantime, stay tuned for the episode with Arrival Bank coming up later this week, kind of continuing our discussion on small businesses. As always, if you enjoy what you're listening to, please hit subscribe, hit like, and check out Finovate.com for information on all of our upcoming events. Don't forget, the discount code Finovate Podcast will save you 20% off of tickets to any future show. And again, information on all of them is available at Finovate.com. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us on the Finovate Podcast this week. Brought to you by the team behind Finovate and produced in association with Provoke Media. Make sure you tell your friends about the show, leave us a review on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to our show, and check out our upcoming events at Finovate.com.